Okay, hey Jaden, how are you going?
Great. How you doing?
Yeah, not bad. So we're touching base on what work you've done in the poverty space. So, what are you working on now?
Yeah, so I'm with I helped set up the Antipoverty Centre in 2021. So almost, well, actually just over 2 years ago now. We started in May 2021, and myself and I established it with Kristen O'Connell. We both came from the Australian Unemployed Workers Union, so we kind of cut our teeth in anti-poverty activism, and a lot of policy and communications there, and wanted to move on from more doing less of like mass movement stuff that the union focuses on, and doing more space in like policy development and advocacy as well, just basically to change the way in which you know professionals and politicians and other policy advocates in the space, kind of the way that they talk about poverty and the way that they engage people who are in poverty in developing those policies. So that's kind of really what we set the Anti-Poverty Centre up to do. So just been doing that for 2 years. So yeah, we've done quite a bit, but yeah, there's always more
Yeah,
to do.
yeah, absolutely. And did you find that was it hard to get people on board with the focus, like moving from the unemployed workers union and working with a lot of people in that space? Was it something that you'd been thinking about for a long time?
Yeah, so I, because as you know, Tim, having done policy with you back in the day, when I was still at uni, I have just kind of like took a real kind of deep interest in the policy aspect of it. And when I started like having conversations with people about what I wanted to do, like everyone was, pretty supportive. And personally, I wanted to take it in a more, radical, but it's not even really that radical if you think about it. It's just doing it differently, and that is actually helping people. Yeah, everyone's been really, really supportive. And yeah, we've got heaps of really supportive people, particularly like our oversight committee. We've got, like Elise Klein, who's an associate professor at ANU, and we've got also like a May Zizi, who's with Anglicare Australia and stuff. So got a lot of, really supportive people who are also just as passionate as us about the space as well. So it's been, you know, well, I say relatively easy to set up because I have no kind of concept about establishing things, and it is what it is. So it's been, yeah, it's been a pretty wild ride, and it's been pretty good so far.
Yeah, and do you find that your idea of how to put pressure on, because you work with state and in state on the state and in the federal space, um, do you find that you, because you've come in from the background that you have, that you've come with sort of fresh ideas? So it's not the sort of do you work in a different way than sort of traditional NGOs in that space?
Yeah, so we mainly just work with like on the federal level. So we do a lot
Yep.
of stuff with Canberra, and some stuff with the federal bureaucracies as well. And it's just kind of really about like employment services and the way that they operate. So like one of the things that I've just been doing for the past what is it now, 2023, 3 years, has been focused on employment services and looking at ways to remove like the more punitive like mutual obligation system, and particularly like programs like Work for the Dole, but also
Mm.
looked at obviously like raising payments. And it was during COVID that we were the one of the first groups when I was with the AEW to call for payments to be lifted to the Henderson poverty line, which at that time they were, even though it was a temporary measure. And then we noticed that from there, a lot of other groups like the Greens and some bigger non-government orgs also started following suit and saying, started to raise the payments to the Henderson poverty line.
Mm. And like you came in at it's been a really interesting time because we came to the end of pretty much a diabolical liberal government that introduced Parents Next, cashless welfare cards, pretty much a war on the war on poor, like on the poor working class people, single parents, anyone that they could put in their sort of in a basket of people that they just wanted to demonize. That from my observations,
Yeah.
like it's probably the most morally bankrupt thing you could possibly do is kicking people the way they have. Like, how did you find coming in and then seeing that there was a chance when the government looked like it was going to go, they were going to be defeated? Did you see there was a real opportunity to get rid of those sort of mutual obligation programs?
Yeah, like I think like a lot of some other people, I wouldn't say a lot of people, but some other people, kind of felt had a bit of nervous energy with the change of government because they ran obviously a very small targeted campaign and they didn't want to give too much away because they were scared that they could lose it, which is obviously now just an absurd notion. So didn't really know what to expect. But one of the first things that the new government has done, new, it's now a year old, the government has done is set up a committee into employment services, or sorry, the Workforce Australia, which is the mainstream employment services. So we have been doing a bit of work and engaging with that. And that conversation about getting rid of mutual obligations is happening, but there is a lot of hesitation from members of that committee, I think, to actually they think that some form of mutual obligations need to be informed um, and what it is, though, that could come, we're not entirely sure. But there is some kind of hopeful signal. Like we saw that just right before the recent budget, that the government abolished the parent. I'll use say abolish
Oh,
asterisk.
yeah, there's always an
Abolished,
asterisk.
yeah,
Yeah.
abolished the Parents Next program. And in a pretty short turnaround, they made got rid of mutual obligations for single parents of kids under the age of 8, um, which is great and it's totally necessary. And now they're beginning a co-design program. But in the report that they released where they abolished Parents Next, there was kind of language that kind of did indicate that there should be some form of engagement or mutual obligation, if not using that word. So it is still obviously very early days, and that co-design process is only just beginning now. So I guess we'll have to just wait and see how serious they are. But going back to like Workforce Australia and the mutual obligations there, I think that's going to be a much harder battle, particularly as the coalition government is now ramping up its dole bludger kind of
Yeah.
narrative.
Yeah, those tropes. Is that the main challenge that you have, is to fight this sort of uh, community? Like, Labor really pitched hard to the right in order to win the election, adopted a lot of liberal policies just to win an election, as you mentioned, the small target stuff. But do you think there's a cultural thing in Australia where those will just, they should just work for it. They should do more. Like, if they just go off their backside, all of those things that the Liberals roll out, the scare campaigns, is that something that you find that is going to be a real challenge, like especially with the Labor government trying to fight those ideas that are already sort of embedded in sort of the Australian community? Is that something that you think will be a real challenge?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if like just the dole bludger narrative was actually created by the Labor Party in the late 1970s with stagflation. And you obviously know, like, the economic reforms of the 1980s and 1990s, you started seeing the use of the word or phrase, I should say, welfare dependency, and this notion that you couldn't allow for people to stay on social security for too long, or whatever it is, otherwise they'd become addicted to it, basically, like an addict, which is obviously not the case because that's not how poverty works. But anyway, so that narrative is just what, as you pointed out, it's a cultural thing. Like, we, I think, believe that in order to receive something, you in return have to perform something back. But what is totally ignored about that is the work that everyone does in their everyday lives, and that's kind of the conversation that we're trying to put out there and and talk about, is like, the care work that we do for each other in our communities. A lot of unemployed people they are working to take care of their parents. They're working to take care of sick family members, neighbors, elderly neighbors, what have you. Everyone's always doing something. And if they're not doing it for someone else, they're doing it for themselves. They might have a disability, and they might have mental health issues as well that, they're trying to get on top of. But because we don't have those, universal services where it's easy for people, there's not a lot they can do, and then they do end up being, long-term unemployed and becoming a statistic. But going back to that conversation that needs to be had is that when they developed work for the dole and all these mutual obligations in the 90s, the what a person looked like on New Start payment, it was then what is now Job Seeker, was very different to what it is today. Then it was generally younger, able-bodied men, but now it's single women, single parents, generally older people as well. And in a recent committee hearing, someone from the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations pointed out that generally younger people are unemployed for like 6 to 9 months, and then they're back in employment. So what are they building a punitive welfare system for if the people who are stuck in it have so many complications, and they're just forced into destitution because the rate is so low and there's no universal services. So obviously you can't summarize that into a
Yeah.
two-word kind of sentence,
Yeah.
but that's just the reality of what we're dealing with here, and we need to find a better way to talk about it. And I think the other thing mainly is just political courage.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I found in the past was you've got just coming face to face with women fleeing domestic violence. They might be in their 60s. They raised the kids. They've got no super, and then they're actually genuinely, the heartbreaking thing for me was they're genuinely shocked that there isn't a system to just that temporary system just to get them from this A to B spot, to be able to get back into a space where they can get training when they're relying on a housing system which is, got a 10-year waiting list, or those sort of punitive, like the financial support, as you said, able-bodied young men like myself, like leaving school in the late 90s, early 2000s, could rely on the New Start allowance that could just probably pay the rent really back then. But today it's just, you got this, as you said, this new cohort of people. But what was fascinating is, like, what I find with your writing is that you always can tie something back into you give a historical perspective, which I think is really important. So you actually show that there is what's possible. And I think with COVID, when the Liberals or the Conservatives being in power literally raised JobKeeper overnight, and it's like, well, I saw politicians at the time genuinely in shock, conservative politicians, and that shows what's possible. Now, what sort of feedback have you got? Do you think there's a willingness to try and have these great reform policies again, or do you think it's going to be a real challenge going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is going to be a bit of a challenge, definitely. But I mean, when it comes to the electorate, I guess that's going to be the question, because obviously what we saw with the last election, there is like a bit of a hunger and a desire for something different to be done, right? People, the electorates are now younger, they're more hungrier, they're aware of generational and social inequity and inequality, and they want something serious to be done about that. And obviously with climate change as well, people really voted for that. So I think it's going to be a bit more difficult, and the government's going to be a bit come unstuck with it if they're not seen to be acting seriously. So their intention is to be a long-term government, and I think that's going to be pretty likely for them. But in what form will be, kind of the interesting thing to look out for. But I think, yeah, it will take a lot of work, and it will take a lot of pressure. But I mean, anything's kind of possible if we slowly begin to kind of mobilize and start having these conversations and start pushing. And I think it will be, quite easy, maybe.
Yeah. Well, the you came out at a real interesting time because the not only like the governments, there were a lot of tight elections. Conservatives managed to hold on, and then COVID hits, and then it exposed not only the health system, but it exposed all of these other things that all these other inequalities that were already really relevant and in people's faces. And you could see the marches in America, and like culture wars that have been like pushed on different communities, and then it's shone a light on a lot of other issues that we've had. But how do you think the COVID pandemic, how do you think that shaped the way that things have gone? As it compounded already something that's already been already a terrible problem, and and do you think there's an opportunity in the COVID, as bad as it was, the COVID pandemic, to try and make those changes?
Yeah, I think, as pointed out, like COVID really did expose, how much of, our social institutions are failing. And it just kind of sped it up as well in other ways as well, because, you know, we're now spending, well, we know where the money's going, and that money is to rebuilding, and it's going to, funds like building submarines, or it's going to tax increases, or it's not being, pulled back for, gas and oil. Now, obviously, that was the thing about Morrison, but, I think people are becoming aware that, even, I'm old enough now to know that, the health system was more accessible than it is today, just over the past, 30 years. And that degradation obviously started with the Howard, and then, and particularly as, like, the Abbott governments come in. So I think, a lot of people who are old enough to remember that even just slight differences to how it's changed are really hungry for a return to universalism. Like, people are going through university education, and now they're coming out with degrees that'll cost them even more and more, and they won't have secure enough jobs to be able to pay them back adequately. You know, people can't access dental care, and, even hospital care is, totally inadequate. And just even the horror stories coming out about aged care, they're just, yeah, I think people are beginning to become aware that their social services and, social institutions are failing, and they want them to be better.
Yeah, I one thing I did notice is the way that you talked about university, like doubling arts degrees, what impact
Yeah.
that would have, taking away, I would argue, one of the degrees that sort of the glue thing that holds a lot of society together, to actually critically think about, what we're doing and where we're going. Just that one thing would not only deter people from getting an education, but if they do choose, they're going to be, strapped with this sort of debt that, will haunt, like, just follow them around. Um, how do you, like, post World War II, knowing that there was a full on Reconstruction period, and, Australia has in the past proven that we can rise to an occasion and turn around and build houses if we have to, or provide the services. Have you found other examples around the world that, that have changed the ways that they've done things to try and deal with the issues that we are confronting now? And, are there any ways? Are there any things that we can take from that?
Yeah, I mean, I, there aren't any, like, particular examples that I can think of off the top of my head, but I mean, some of the bigger ones are, the way that, some European countries value, what people do for their culture and their societies, like a lot of, social programs to encourage artists to, follow and pursue their artistic careers, because they're aware of how much that contributes to not only the local economy, but also to the way in which people engage with their community, and what it gives to people's lives. And, you know, um, that's something that definitely should be explored here, because, you know, I think in Australia we lose so much to the like overseas and Europe and stuff, because people are just like, well, there's no point doing it here because like it's so hard and it's so expensive. So things like that. And I mean, like you're starting to see, like minimum basic income programs around artists, and as a way to you know, influence, or sorry, to reduce poverty. And I'm not entirely sold, and I'm not a proponent of a lot of the basic income models in there because I do believe in basic universal services first and foremost. But I think that there is the argument and the case to remove a lot of conditionality poorer for the poor classes of our society, to give them access to a wage to sustain like a bare minimum of living, and then also to give people the option to pursue careers that aren't valued in current modern day Australia.
Yeah, and you're working in the Anti-Poverty Centre. It's early days in its formation. How many people are you working with?
So just at the moment, it's mainly just myself and Kristen, and we do a lot of the day to day and a lot of the submissions. But we're now hoping that we'll be able to get some funding through, and then we'll start to be able to bring more people in and get them involved, particularly around projects. So one of the projects that we're looking on into at the moment is how to develop a community consultation group, particularly of folks in poverty, to better influence policy decision making for the programs that impact them, or that they're either forced to participate in, or that because of their circumstances they're required to attend. Because obviously, having been in employment services myself, like they're just totally shit. Like they don't actually engage with you. They don't have, they don't try and individualize and understand what it is that's going on with you. And they just have these broad rules, and people are being destroyed by them. So, we kind of want to give a bit more of like a direct democratic oversight for people who are going to be subjected to these, programs that are developed or being developed, as a way for like accountability, as a way for access, and to bring people in as a community, because that's the other thing, is like we've just been so hyper individualized and forced out into ticky tacky little boxes and out of suburbs. And we need to find ways to bring each other back together, to have conversations, to talk about the kind of community that we want to build and the kind of societies and cultures that we do want to have. And I think that's just one of the things that just totally, if not, it's already really bad, but it's only going to
Mm.
get worse unless we do something about it. So yeah, that's one of the things we're
Yeah.
working on.
Yeah, yeah, it's a lot, and I mean, like we're looking at it. We spoke earlier, outside of the outside of this conversation about the housing crisis and what's going on. We've got this, whole class of of homo like investment culture and people falling by the wayside. So when people are spending 40-50% of their income on like rents and just absolutely struggling. So it just absolutely limits the scope of what they can do and their freedom of movement to be able to,
Yeah.
get in, as you said, like the whole idea of a society and culture that we want to live in. It's the people. And that doesn't operate very well when people are, subjected to such pressures, and, yeah. So like we're in sort of unprecedented times. How do you sort of view, do you see the poverty issue in Australia? Is it accelerating at a pace that will force government's hand? Do you think that they'll have to make a decision and have to go, okay, right now we just have to, like the JobKeeper, for example, to counter a pandemic? Like we can't have this many people in poverty, otherwise, things actually structurally start to fall apart. Also, society, people end up turning on each other. We've seen in America, culture wars become, the thing, more susceptible. do you see the issue of poverty, the acceleration becoming worse, and do you think that will be something that will really force the hand of policymakers to do the right thing?
Yeah, I think that it's going to get to a point where they're going to have to do something serious about it. Like if you look at it, you know, in the I think it was past two budgets, but two recent budgets. The recent one, you had the $40 a fortnight, which is totally inadequate. $20 a week, when rents are climbing, higher than that. But anyway, and then yeah, and even the 15% increase to Commonwealth rent assistance, that's just a subsidy program for landlords. And then the one before that was a Liberal government when they brought an end to the job seeker COVID supplement. They increased payments $50 a fortnight. So if you look at that historically, the last time that there was any kind of real increase, not that these were real increases, but an increase to unemployment payments was the early 1990s. So two increases in a very short succession is an indication that they know that this is going to be a hot button issue that they're going to have to do something about. And a lot of that pressure as well, I think, we need to be aware of the groups that have been doing it, like the Australian Unemployed Workers Union, who started around 2016, and then the ACOS Raise the Rate campaign. Even though they're asking for two different rates, and they have two different ways of going about and doing that, has come from them, and particularly stuff around robo debt, not my debt, Natural Wolf as well. There's been like a real kind of hard focus on the rights of people on social security. So it's going to be a lot harder and harder, particularly as this housing crisis, which it's only getting worse and worse by the days that pass. And every time that you're reading about it or talking to analysts, they're saying it's not going to get any better. It's only going to get worse. So you know, and I think the other reason why the Labor Party is so scared of what the Greens are doing in that space, and why they thought if they could apply a lot of pressure on them that they would just give up. But you know, they're worried because that message and that kind of forthright, uh, you know, just sticking to it, just being like, no, this is our way, and you've got to do it, is actually resonating with people, and I think that's kind of scaring Labor a bit. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
it's going to hit a pressure point soon. Yeah,
yeah. Well, what I found fascinating is, it was a couple of months ago, but I was out on a door knock around the housing issue, and I door knocked someone in Fremantle. They owned their own place. They were probably in their 50s or early 60s. They own their own house down near Fremantle. They said that they admitted we're wealthy. Our kids have grown up, but our kids can't even get a rental, and we can support them. Help subsidize the rent, help them get through tough times. But we can't. This is something that's really bad. Like, it's really bad, and my kids are having to make a choice. Well, whether they can even, they've had to move back into the house. They've been real limited in their sort of movement. They've had to drop courses that they were on. And in fact, the same couple, they had to take, they were part of the class action to take the government to court over the Robodebt scandal. And so they were
yeah, wow.
lobbying the former member of, the former two members of Curtin, Celia Hammond and Julie Bishop, about how bad, because they were getting these robodebt. One of the kids had this robodebt notice. It mental health issues, something that it was an outcome of this robodebt notice, and they had the money to pay it, let alone people who don't. And the cruelty of a system which is basically left up to an automated system with no heart
Yeah.
is sort of horrific, in my mind, and people are seeing it. And so, as you said, I don't think it's going to go away. And regardless
No.
of who's in power, they're going to have to deal with it.
Yeah.
So it will be interesting to see whether they change things. But I did hear rumblings that some of the more sort of inner city Labor members are thinking, "Oh, geez, this might be coming our way, like the Teals are." But time will tell. But for you, personally, how do you What sparked your interest in sort of social justice? How did you find
Mm.
yourself on the path to where you are now? Like, it's a long journey, but was there one incident when you were like one instance that when you were younger going, this
Yeah.
is unfair and I need to deal with it? Was that something that happened?
I think a lot of it is mainly to do like, I grew up, with a single parent household. My mum, being on payments. I remember, being at Centrelink when I was quite young. I went to public schools, and saw like where I went to school in Duncraig. It was just like this perfect middle ground because on one side of Marmion Highway you had Sorrento, so you had all these massive, beautiful houses by the beach. And then on the other side, the further you went east, the poorer it would get. It went from like working class into like, Kingsley and Greenwood. And then the further out you'd go east, the more poor and poorer it gets. So, there was kind of like it was this melting pot. But, I wasn't a good student. I dropped out of high school and stuff. But I think it was like, so it was kind of just like that and being aware of, you know, just how divided literally our society was, or whenever I think back about high school or like some of my friends, and I'd be like, oh, some of them were like really rich and some of them were really poor. Um, and yeah, and also just being a journalist and like spending time in Myanmar as well, and kind of just thinking like, uh, you know, what am I trying to do with my life? I need to go back to Australia and do something about it there. And that's where I started becoming a little bit more political. And I dipped my feet in the pool of Labor, and then I shifted to Greens, and now I'm no longer as a part of any political machine. But it was just this kind of desire that it's just like, things don't have to be this way. I want to live in a world where, kids like me don't have to, and like kids like me and the kids I went to high school don't have to be in a world that's so punishing and unfair. And, I think, yeah, like I also got stung when I was with a partner. Back in the day, I was studying full time. Um, and also working part time and getting youth allowance. But when I updated my, partner, or I had a partner or whatever, I ended up getting like a $2,000-3,000 debt from Centrelink because of how much they earn. And like I was just like, that's just like totally unfair. Like we split rent equally. We don't share any bank accounts. Like, my money is my money, her money is her money. But that wasn't enough to Centrelink. They just wanted to claw back whatever money they could. Um, and because I wasn't able to get Oz study anymore, I ended up having to work two jobs while studying full time in order to survive and get a degree. And it was yeah, it was a pretty rough period of my life. um and yeah, so even though I was a young white able-bodied male with recent work history and stuff, I was able to get those jobs, and I was lucky to get them and had connections to get them. But like, I don't wish that on anyone else because it made me feel like garbage, and
Mm.
nobody deserves to feel like garbage.
Yeah, that's it's that sort of lived experience is a big thing. I sort of echo sort of you in a way, like because when I was growing up and I was in state housing and single parent, three sisters, we'd have like birthdays and like I grew up in Albany and we'd have people like parents dropping off their kids to my sisters or my birthday or whatever, and we're in this shitty sort of state house, and they come from Middleton Beach, you know what I mean? Like they're, and you're sort of embarrassed, I bet you I guess my mum might have been, but you as a kid, you sort of don't see it, but in hindsight, it's in your face, like the inequality and the barriers, and then
Yeah.
being subjected to, like when I came up to Perth, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. Like my dad was a labourer, worked in construction and mining, and so I go, where am I going to go? Like, so I thought I had this idea. I think I was like 21 or 22. I'll go to I signed up for youth allowance, and then I ended up like at one of those centers, you know, like sitting there
Yeah, right.
filling out like resumes and CVs, and then putting these really unrealistic expectations, you know, on you. So I'd go there like twice a week, and then I'd use their printer and their scanner and all this, just and you know, and it didn't get me anywhere. Like, you know, and it was actually a privatized service. It was Howard's. It was one of Howard's privatized. You know, it's the first. I
Mm,
think one of the first or second waves is of the system being privatized. And I remember this guy who'd been there for like 3 months, and he ended up like I ended up knowing him later because he ended up playing bass in a band. And I leant over and I said to him, I go, "Is there any point us being here?" And he goes, "No, not really. It's just a tick and flick thing." I
yeah,
actually thought I could get an outcome, and
yeah,
so I had to go and I just signed up for a work agency, Workpack, which you know they just get labourers and then put them out on work sites, and then they were like the work. I remember the work service that I went to. I think it was in Belmont, and they called me up and they said, "Oh." I said, "Well, I've got a job," and they're like, "No, no, no, you don't have a job. You know, you're working through a work agency." And then only, you know, because I just didn't know how the system worked. And
yeah,
later, I found out that the only way that they got extra money or a bonus if I actually got a proper full time job, and they could
yeah,
tick it off as being their service did it. So they were discouraging me to take on work when I desperately needed money. I had no
yeah,
money, you know, and yet they were trying to discourage me from taking work, which led to another job
yeah.
because of them wanting to keep, you know, them wanting to make money out of my situation. And you know, only years later, I was like, that's totally ludicrous, you know. And I guess
Like,
it sort
yeah,
of led to, yeah, it's wild.
like the employment services system is like they literally are treating unemployed people like a commodity. They trade and buy and sell them like, you know, a book that's I've got it on here on my desk, so I remember the names like, you know, Siobhan O'Sullivan, Michael McGann, and Mark Considine wrote called Buying and Selling the Poor. It's a really good kind of book about the history of employment services, but they also go to different ones around the country. To talk to the staff there and kind of learn about who's coming in through those doors. But you know, it is that you know these privatized services, whether they're not for profit or for profit, as some are, they treat people like a commodity because for each you know outcome that they get, somebody they get a payment back or they get an engagement fee. So every time you have your first meeting, you get a payment, or whether they put you on work for the dole or you know, there's it's a way to do it. But like APM, which is Advanced Personnel Management, which is based out of you know WA, is the one of the biggest in the world now. Like you know, it's a for-profit service, and they operate in you know England and Europe and Australia. They've got stuff in pretty sure in America and bunch and like just all over the place. And it's $1 billion private company that's on the market. You know, they're on the Australian Stock Exchange. And I was reading an article in the West Australian just this week, and the owner, I can't remember the exact quote, but basically saying like, "Oh, we're not too worried about you know our employment services side of the business because we know that'll pick up." Which is basically a concession to say that once unemployment goes up, we know we're going to have people coming through those doors, so that's going to help us. So it's like they're even self-aware that they're treating people like a commodity. The government is aware that they know this because they have, you know, they have activists, they have academics, they have, you know, the people like that. Just it's out there in the open, but everyone's kind of just a bit like, ah,
Yeah,
it's just like
and
that just can't sustain anymore.
yeah, and this industrialization of the poor, like they're being subsidized by government money, right? So,
Yeah,
like, and I'm guessing the privatization of these services actually costs more than what it costs to actually just deliver a service to the poor, like to be a state system that actually, you know, prevents people from dropping into poverty. Like, have you found that with your own studies that actually the subsidization of these privatized industry, the industrialization of the poor, is in fact costs more than what it would cost if they actually did their job to protect people? Is that something that it's come up, or is it just in
yeah.
certain circumstances?
So have looked at like you know contracts for employment services like over
Mm,
over the years. I
mm,
think we went back as late
mm,
as 2010, but
mm.
like I can't remember the figures off by heart, and it's
Yeah.
in a report that's coming out within the next few months. So stay tuned. But
Yeah.
it's worth like tens of billions of dollars. Like
Yeah.
in total, it would probably be closer to $50 billion
Yeah.
thereabouts in the past
Yeah.
decade or so. And that's just the contracts alone. That's not we don't like
Yeah.
with other payments and stuff that come
Yeah.
along with that as well.
I'd love to know. I would, maybe it's worth putting some FOIs in, like the meetings that these companies have, the minutes, the amount of time, like, as they'd hire a lobbying firm to do to do their deeds, but the donations,
Mm.
it's like, the prison system, the industrialization, the prison, like your privatization, Serco.
Yeah,
We're just gonna, like, in America, I think I read a stat the other day that over 2 million people are incarcerated in the US. That's a hell of a lot. That's a hell of a lot of free labor, you know.
yeah,
And that's what worried. Going back to what you said about the narrative around mutual obligations, working for the dole. Where does it lead? Like, what is the end game of this? And what sort of world will we live in if it just keeps going down this path? That's a real question.
yeah. I think well, what they're finding is like like they can't keep doing it, and that this is why they've had this
Yeah.
inquiry that's set to report in September. And there's some kind of other small things that are happening that I've noticed, which shows that they're kind of gearing up to do something about it. Because they're aware that like the current system as it stands is totally unviable, and it cannot continue the way it is. Um, and I think it goes back to that thing about political courage, right? Like the thing with Work for the Dole, Michaelia Cash and the coalition to come out, and they're going to get real hard on it, and they're going to try and like wedge Labor, so using their words, on this as an issue. And I think they just need to take the courage to be like, you know what, no, we're gonna take a stand against this, because we know that you've even got some of the providers who are giving evidence to inquiry saying we don't like Work for the Dole. You have some like Work for the Dole operators who are just like, we don't like Work for the Dole because it's really hard to manage. The payments, for them as an incentive are pretty shit. And so there's not really much point keeping it, but the coalition are just using it as a stick to beat Labor with. So Labor kind of just need to go like, well, we know that it doesn't work, and we know that we're probably going to lose a couple of votes, but we just need to take the courage to do it. And so I think through this process, and we'll be able to get somewhere. I mean, I don't have a lot of confidence that it's going to be good, but what I do know is that they're aware that the system doesn't work anymore, and that something needs to change about it. But what it's going to change into is going to be a real big question. And I think, you know, it's going to be interesting to see what that vision is. But I guess it's a vision for a full employment economy. But again, what does a full employment economy mean when some people just simply cannot work, and they have, other issues that they need to be supported regardless, not based on their
Yeah.
ability to work?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think, yeah, it will be interesting to see. And you said, when's that report coming out? That's
So the Workforce Australia Committee reports in September, so
Oh, cool.
September this year. So we'll
So
find out more then.
I think we'll definitely touch base again after that, because it'd be great to sort of
Yeah,
dissect it, and your perspectives on that report would be really cool to talk through. But um, just before we go, like, there's a lot of stuff that you're dealing with in regards to heavy subject matter. Um, Thinking about, you're face to face with people who are in really terrible situations, but also it's fuel to your fire to try and advocate to get the best outcomes you can. How do you rest, and how do you recharge yourself? Because I try and ask that to people, because a lot of people
yeah,
burn themselves out on this, and I know I have to check myself every now and again to see where I'm going. But how do you do it? How do you keep going?
yeah. I Well, biggest thing is footy. Like watching Freo,
Yeah,
particularly, the start of the season wasn't great, but
yeah,
the last few rounds before the bye have been pretty
yeah,
good. So that's like definitely one of my new things that I get away with is just like
yeah,
spending time watching the footy, and also just like spending time with friends, and also not getting too hyper focused on a lot of the stuff that I do as well. Like
Yeah.
it's okay to not be thinking and talking about obviously
Mm,
we're all really passionate about certain
mm,
things and we want to see that change, but sometimes it's just okay to like, I don't know, talk shit and hang out
yeah.
with your mates. And yeah, it's just like some of the biggest things. So yeah, basically
Yeah.
maintaining that community of friends and comrades and just hanging out
Yeah.
and doing the small things that, let you breathe for a few hours a week.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for this chat. It's been awesome. I really enjoyed.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me.
No, it's cool. And what I'll do is I'll put a lot of the links in the sort of the chat.
Yeah.
And as things progress, we'll be talking. So I'll sort of update.
Yeah. Sure.
But yeah, I do really appreciate this conversation because we're in a real fascinating time. The world's sort of blowing itself up in certain ways. Trumpism and all this crazy stuff going in the background. But at the end of the day, there are windows and little there's cracks of light that you can sort of pursue, and there's opportunity there. So being able to talk to you about those opportunities and possibilities is been really great. So we'll get back. We'll have another conversation later in the year after this report
Yeah.
comes out. But
Sure.
yeah, we'll see what happens. But yeah, keep doing what you're
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah. Will do. Yeah. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I'll chat soon.
Okay, cheers.
Thanks.